Evelyn stood at the altar, a thing of ivory lace and frozen fear. The man beside her, Silas Croft, was a full 30 years older than her 19 summers. His hand on her arm was possessive, the skin dry as old parchment, the knuckles thick. He smelled of tobacco and stale coin. The small church was cold, despite the potbelly stove roaring in the corner. It was a cold that came from the people. She could feel their eyes on her. Not admiration for the bride, but pity. A quiet, shaming pity that settled over the pews like dust. Her father sat in the front row, his gaze fixed on his worn boots. This was his doing. A debt, he had said, a debt of $5,000 that could only be paid with his daughter. Evelyn was the currency, the final transaction in a ledger stained with bad whiskey and worse luck. The preacher, Reverend Miles, hurried his words. He knew, just as everyone in this small Montana town knew, that this was no union of love. It was an acquisition. Silas Croft, who owned the bank, the general store, and half the county, was acquiring another asset. "And do you, Evelyn," the preacher's voice snagged, "take this man." She wanted to say no. The word was a hot, solid thing in her throat, a stone she couldn't swallow or spit out. She looked past the preacher, through the warped glass of the church window. The sky was a low, bruised purple, heavy with unspoken promises of snow. It was a mirror of her own heart. She felt her father's desperate gaze. She felt Silas Croft's impatience, a slight, warning pressure on her arm. "I do." The voice was not her own. It was a whisper, thin as a thread. But it was enough. It sealed her life. The journey to the Croft Ranch began less than an hour later. Silas had not wanted to waste time with celebrations. "We've a storm coming on," he'd said, his voice flat. "And I mean to be home by nightfall." Home. The word felt like a lie. Her home was a small, struggling homestead now forfeit. This new place, Silas's grand ranch house she had only seen from a distance, was to be her cage. She sat in the enclosed carriage, the new leather seat cold beneath her expensive wedding dress. Silas had paid for the dress, another mark of ownership. A driver named Jed, a man whose face was a roadmap of frostbite scars, sat outside, handling the team of 4 horses. Silas himself had ridden ahead on his own stallion, eager to get back to his accounts, leaving his new bride to be delivered like freight. The wind began its low moan as they cleared the edge of town. At first, it was just a sound, a lonely complaint against the pines. But as the carriage climbed into the foothills, the sound grew teeth. The wind no longer moaned, it shrieked. Snow, which had been falling in lazy, undecided flakes, suddenly turned sharp and horizontal. It came in a blinding sheet, a white fury that erased the world. Evelyn pressed her face to the glass, but there was nothing to see. The world was gone, replaced by a swirling, deafening whiteness. The carriage slowed, the horses snorting in protest. She could hear Jed shouting at them, his words ripped away by the gale. Then came the lurch, a sudden, violent tilt that threw her from the seat. The carriage groaned, a sound of splintering wood, and tipped onto its side with a heavy, sickening crash. Evelyn screamed as she landed hard against the upholstered wall, her heavy veil tangling around her face. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the terrified, high-pitched screaming of the horses. She fumbled for the door latch, her hands, trapped in silk gloves, clumsy and useless. She finally found the handle, shoved the door upward against the weight of the snow, and clawed her way out. The wind hit her like a solid wall. It stole the air from her lungs and pierced her thin dress as if it were muslin. She sank to her knees in a drift that was already waist-deep. "Jed!" she cried, her voice barely a whisper. She saw him. He had been thrown from the driver's box and lay twisted near the struggling horses. One of the carriage wheels was shattered. They were stranded. "Jed!" she screamed again, crawling toward him. He was alive, but his leg was trapped beneath a fallen branch, and his head was bleeding. He looked at her, his eyes wide with pain and the stark, immediate fear of a frontiersman who knew what this meant. "The horse!" he gasped, pointing. "You gotta cut the traces. Ride!" But the horses were mad with panic, kicking and rearing. One had already fallen, its leg broken. Evelyn looked at the tangled mess of leather and panicked horseflesh, and then at the knife on Jed's belt. She could never get close enough. She was no rancher's daughter. She was a town girl, raised to read books and sew, and now she was useless. "Go!" Jed grunted, his face pale. "Follow the tree line, south. Might be a line shack. Can't stay here. You'll freeze in 20 minutes. "I can't leave you." "You'll die if you stay," he said, his voice hard. "Go! Now!" He closed his eyes, his breath coming in ragged, white plumes. Tears froze on her cheeks. Panic, cold and sharp as the ice forming on her eyelashes, seized her. He was right. To stay was to die. To leave was a betrayal. She looked at the blood on his temple, dark against the snow. She turned and ran, or she tried. The snow was a thick, wet cement. Her beautiful dress, the symbol of her sail, was now her shroud. The heavy skirt soaked up the snow, weighing her down, tangling around her legs. The wind tore at her veil, ripping it from her hair. She stumbled, fell, rose, and stumbled again. She had no idea where a south was. The world was a white, howling chaos. The trees were vague, ghostly shapes that offered no direction, only the threat of unseen drops and hidden gullies. Her lungs burned. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was inside her, in her bones, a deep, numbing ache that was slowly turning to sleepiness. "This is where I die," she thought. Not in a warm bed, but in a wedding dress, in a blizzard. Not even a wife and already a widow to a life she never wanted. She fell again, this time too exhausted to rise. She curled into herself, the lace of her cuffs freezing to her wrists. She was about to let the heavy, peaceful numbness take her. And then she saw it. It was so faint she thought she had imagined it. A pinprick of yellow light, impossibly small. Off to her right, it blinked, vanished behind the curtain of snow, then reappeared. It was steady, it was real. A structure, a house, a cabin. Hope, a desperate, animal thing, surged through her. It gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She got to her feet, her legs shaking, and fixed her eyes on that light. It was her only compass. She pushed through drifts that were taller than she was, clawing her way with numb hands. The light grew, separating from a pinprick into the distinct, fogged square of a window. She saw the dark shape of a roof peaked with snow. A cabin, a small, rough-hewn hunting cabin, hunkered down against the storm as if it had grown from the earth. She reached the door and collapsed against it. Her hands were too frozen to make a fist. She beat against the solid wood with her forearms, a weak, frantic drumming. "Please," she choked out, the words stolen by the wind. "Please help me." She heard a sound from within, a scraping, the heavy thud of a bar being lifted. The door cracked open, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the snow. A man stood in the opening. He was huge, filling the doorframe, a silhouette against the firelight within. He wore buckskins and a heavy beard that was more brown than black. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of the mountain, solid and immovable. His eyes, narrowed against the wind, widened in disbelief. He was looking at a ghost, a woman, caked in snow and ice, dressed in the ruined finery of a wedding gown. Evelyn stared at him, unable to speak, and then her strength gave out completely. She pitched forward. He caught her before she hit the floor. He was strong, his arms scooping her up as if she weighed nothing. With one boot, he kicked the door shut, plunging the room back into the warm dimness. The sound of the storm instantly muffled to a distant, angry roar. He carried her to the hearth, A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire blazing within it. He laid her down on a thick bearskin rug that was spread before the flames. The heat was a shock. It was so intense it was painful. Evelyn began to shake, a deep, rattling, uncontrollable violence that seemed to start in her teeth and spread to her very bones. She couldn't stop. She curled into a tight ball, her hands clenched, her eyes wide and staring. The man stood over her for a long moment, simply watching. He was a man not used to company, much less this kind. His cabin was one room, meticulously kept but sparse. A cot on one side, a table, 2 chairs, shelves carved into the walls holding tins and books. Animal pelts hung from the rafters, and a fine rifle rested on a rack above the door. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. He went to a chest, pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket, gray and rough. He knelt beside her. She flinched as he reached for her, but his touch was impersonal. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, tucking it tightly. "You'll founder like this," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel, unused. He turned back to the fire, where a tin coffee pot sat simmering on the coals. He grabbed a metal mug from a hook, poured the steaming black liquid, and brought it to her. "Drink." It was not a request. Her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. He knelt again, his face close to hers. She could smell the pine smoke on him, and leather, and something else, something wild and clean. He held the mug to her lips. "Sip it, it's hot." The coffee was bitter and scalding, but it was life. It burned a path down her frozen throat and into her stomach, a small, central fire. She coughed, but he held the mug steady until she had taken several sips. He sat back on his heels, watching her. His gaze was unnerving. It was not unkind, but it was intense, curious, and held a deep, settled sadness she was too numb to recognize. He looked at the ruined dress, the silk and lace now just a sodden, clinging mess. He looked at her bare hands, red and swollen. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. "To be out in this, in that?" Evelyn swallowed. The warmth was starting to bring feeling back, and with feeling came pain. Her feet and hands throbbed. She had to lie. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous. Silas's reach was long. I was visiting family," she stammered, the words sounding hollow in the quiet room. "On the North Ridge, our sleigh. It overturned. The driver—" She stopped, the image of Jed's bloody face flashing in her mind. "I got lost." The man, Callum, though she did not know his name, watched her. His expression did not change. He knew the North Ridge. He knew there were no homesteads there, not for 20 miles. He knew the lie for what it was. But he also saw the genuine, bone-deep terror in her eyes. It was a fear that went beyond the storm. He gave a slow nod, accepting the story she offered, if not the truth of it. He stood up, turning his back to her, and tossed another log onto the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. "Well, you're not lost anymore, ma'am," he said, his back still to her. "But you're not leaving either." Evelyn looked toward the single, small window. It was no longer a window. It was a solid pane of white. The snow already drifted halfway up the glass. The wind hammered against the shutters, a relentless, angry fist. The man was right. The storm had sealed them in. The realization landed on her with a new, different kind of weight. She had escaped the carriage, but she was now trapped in this tiny, one-room cabin with a stranger, a mountain man whose eyes held shadows she could not begin to understand. "How long?" she whispered. He glanced at the window. "This is a 3-day blow, maybe 4. Nothing's getting in and nothing's getting out." 4 days. The words hung in the air between them. 4 days. Trapped with this man. While out there, somewhere, Silas Croft would be realizing his new wife was missing. He would send men. He would hunt for what was his. The man, Callum, seemed to understand her fear, though not its source. He moved to the far side of the cabin, to the narrow cot built against the wall. He picked up the blankets from it and brought them to her, dropping them on the rug. "You take the cot," he said. "It's warmer by the fire." He then went to a peg by the door and took down his own bedroll. He spread it out on the cold floorboards on the other side of the room, near the door, as far away from her as he could get in the small space. He sat on the bedroll and began to pull off his heavy boots. He did not look at her again. Evelyn watched him. He had given her his bed, his blanket, his coffee. He had saved her life. And yet she was terrified of him. She rose on unsteady legs, the gray wool blanket clutched around her, her wet dress dragging at her feet. She moved to the cot and sat, then lay down, curling into herself. She kept the blanket wrapped tight, a useless armor. The fire crackled. The storm howled. In the small, shadowed cabin, two people lay awake, separated by 10 feet of wooden floor and a universe of secrets. Evelyn lay shivering, her mind filled with the image of a broken carriage, a bleeding man, and the cold, parchment grip of her new husband. Callum lay still, his eyes open in the dark, listening to the sound of the storm and the quiet, terrified breathing of the woman who had fallen out of it, a ghost in a wedding dress, bringing the world he had abandoned right back to his door. The night was a descent. Evelyn did not remember falling asleep. She remembered falling into a darkness that was both freezing and on fire. The storm was no longer outside. It was in her blood, a howling, icy wind that shook her from the inside out. Then the ice turned to embers, a dry, consuming heat that baked her skin and made her eyelids feel like weighted leather. She was drifting. Fragments of time floated past her, the red-orange glow of the fire pulsing against her closed eyes, the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor, a shadow, huge and dark, blocking the light. Callum watched her. He had seen this before. The violent shivering that had seized her when she first lay down had stopped in the deep middle of the night, replaced by a stillness that was far more dangerous. He had put his hand to her forehead, a brief, impersonal touch. She was burning. The cold had gone into her lungs, and now the fever was its answer. He cursed, a low, soft sound. He was a man who lived by avoiding complications, and the woman on his cot was a complication he could not send away. He moved with a quiet urgency. His anger at the situation turned toward the simple, practical tasks of survival. He pulled a small tin from his shelf, willow bark. He crushed it with the back of his knife, added it to a cup of hot water, let it steep into a bitter, dark tea. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her. She was heavier than she looked, a dead weight, but her head lolled back, her neck exposed. Her skin was white, almost translucent. "You have to drink," he said, his voice low, pressing the tin cup to her cracked lips. She moaned, turning her head away, but he was firm. He tipped the cup, letting a small trickle of the bitter liquid breach her lips. She coughed, choked, but swallowed. He gave her more, drop by drop, until half the cup was gone. He laid her back down and covered her again, but the heat coming off her was so intense the blankets seemed useless. He sat on the small chair, watching her. He fed the fire, log by log, keeping the cabin a pocket of stifling heat against the raging cold. He saw the way her fingers, lying on top of the blanket, twitched. She was trapped in the fever, fighting a battle he could not see. Hours passed. The storm did not relent. The cabin was a small, resonant drum, the wind and snow beating a constant, maddening rhythm against the logs. He must have dozed, his head nodding forward, when her voice, sharp and terrified, cut through the noise. "Silas." Callum's head snapped up. His eyes focused on her in the dim light. She was thrashing, her head moving back and forth on the pillow, her hands gripping the blanket. "No," she whispered, the word tight with panic.
Please, Silas, no!
Callum stood, his chair scraping loud against the floor. He moved toward the cot, thinking the fever had worsened, that he needed to force more of the willow bark tea into her. She seemed to feel his presence, even in her delirium. Her eyes, still closed, squeezed shut. "Don't touch me!" she whimpered, the words so clear, so full of raw, pleading terror that Callum froze, his hand outstretched. "Please, God, don't touch me!" He drew his hand back as if her skin had become hot iron. He stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with a cold, hard finality. The name, Silas, the wedding dress, the terror that went beyond the storm. He knew the name, of course, Silas Croft, a man who owned half the territory, a man whose ambition was as cold and vast as the Montana winter. This was not a lost traveler. This was not a woman visiting family. This was cargo, lost, damaged cargo, and she was terrified of the man who owned her. He stepped away from the cot. He felt a sudden, suffocating anger that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the world he had left behind. The world of men who bought and sold and took, a world that measured a life in dollars and land. He went to the far side of the room and stood with his back to her, staring at the rifle on his wall. He had come here to escape such men, and now, one of them, by proxy, was sleeping in his bed. He did not sleep again. He sat on his bedroll by the door, listening to her ragged breathing and the undiminished roar of the wind, and waited for the dawn that did not come. The world outside remained a churning, featureless white. The fever broke on the second day. Evelyn woke slowly, as if surfacing from a great, dark depth. Her first sensation was the taste in her mouth, like ash and rust. Her body ached, a deep, hollow soreness, but the fire in her blood was gone. She was weak, but she was clear. The cabin was warm and quiet. The storm still raged, but it sounded farther away. She saw him sitting at the small table, his back to her, mending a leather harness strap. His shoulders were broad, filling the small space. She tried to sit up, and the blanket pooled in her lap. She was still in the wedding dress. It was stiff, cold, and damp. "You're awake," he said, without turning. "How long?" Her voice was a dry croak. "A day, and a night, and a day." He motioned with his head to a cup on the floor beside her. "There's water, and more of the tea. It's bitter, but it works." She drank the water, the cold liquid a blessing on her raw throat. She looked at him, at his broad back, and the shame hit her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered dreams, a dark shape, a hand, and the terror. Had she spoken? I must thank you," she stammered, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "You saved my life." "I made tea." He continued his work, the awl punching through the thick leather with a rhythmic, steady push. I am afraid I may have," she faltered. "I was dreaming. I might have said things." He stopped his work. He laid the awl down on the table, perfectly parallel to the strap. He turned, slowly, and looked at her. His eyes were not cold, but they were not kind. They were just clear, seeing. "You spoke a name." He said, "Silas." Evelyn's breath caught. The lie she had prepared. The story of visiting family died on her lips. It was useless. He had heard. She looked down at her hands, twisting the rough wool of the blanket. The truth, which had been her private prison, suddenly seemed the only thing she had left. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is my husband. We were married 2 days ago." Callum just nodded, his face unreadable. "And you were on your way to his ranch?" "Yes." "And you told me you were lost visiting family." "I was afraid," she said, looking up, meeting his gaze. "You do not know him. He is a powerful man. I am..." His property, Callum finished for her. The word was so blunt, so cruel, it made her flinch, but it was true. Yes, the admission was a relief, a fresh wound. My father owed him a great deal of money, $5,000, a sum we could never repay. This was the payment. She told him then, the words coming in a quiet, steady rush, not of the man she'd been forced to marry, but of the one she had not, a carpenter's son named Thomas, a boy with kind eyes and sawdust in his hair. They had planned to run to Oregon, but her father had found her letters. He had been desperate, broken by debt and the fear of losing his homestead.
He forbade it,
she said, staring at the fire.
He said love was a luxury for the rich, for people like us. There was only duty and debt. So I did my duty.
She looked at Callum. And then the storm came, and I thought, when the carriage fell, I thought God had answered me, that I would die, that it would be better than. She couldn't finish. She remembered his words from her fever dream.
You heard me?
She whispered, shame washing her in a hot flush.
I said, don't touch me.
Callum's gaze did not waver.
I heard.
A long silence settled in the room, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind finding its way through the chinks in the logs. He had given her no comfort, no words of pity. He had simply listened, and in his listening, she felt, for the first time, not judged, just heard. He turned back to the table, but he did not pick up his work. He stared at the wall, at the rows of tins and dried herbs. I knew a man once, he began, his voice distant, rough, as if pulling the words from a deep, dry well. He was not a good man, but he did not know he was a bad one. He thought he was doing his duty, too. He told her. He spoke of the war, but not the one between states, the one that had never ended, the one for the land. He had been a scout, he said, paid by the railroad, and sometimes by the army, paid to track. There was a rumor, he said, his voice flat. A small band of Cheyenne, run off the reservation. They said they had stolen livestock from a rancher south of the Yellowstone. He talked of the ride, a posse of 10 men, hard men, drunk on whiskey and self-righteousness. They had tracked them for 3 days, into the high snows. We found them, he said, in a small camp, by a frozen river. It was not a war party. It was an old man, his wife, his daughter, and his daughter's child. He stopped, his hands, resting on the table, curled into fists so tight his knuckles went white. They had no stolen stock, just 3 tired ponies and a dog. The old man came out, his hands empty. He spoke English. He said they were hungry. They were just trying to find their way back to the agency. Callum's eyes were fixed on something far beyond the cabin wall. Our leader, the man paying, he didn't care. He called them liars. He gave the order. Evelyn put a hand to her mouth, her stomach clenching. The girl, Callum said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear him. She was just a child, maybe 5 years old. She ran. When the shooting started, she just ran out onto the ice of the river. He was quiet for so long, Evelyn thought he had stopped. I had my rifle, he breathed. I was supposed to. The leader shouted at me, shoot. I watched her run. She was so small. He closed his eyes. She fell. Through the ice. I never even raised my gun. He opened his eyes. They were empty. They killed the old man, the women. They burned the teepee. And we rode back. The leader told me I was a coward, that I had forfeited my pay. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, bracing his arms on the stone mantel, staring down into the flames. He was right, he said. I was a coward. I didn't stop it, and I let her fall. I rode away that night. I left them all, left that world. I took my horse and my gun and I came up here. I built this place with my own hands. From trees I felled myself. I have not been to town in 3 years. I have not spoken to another soul. Until you. He turned to look at her, and his face was a mask of old, settled grief.
We all have our ghosts. Ma'am, you're running from yours. I'm just living with mine.
The confession hung in the air, a raw, exposed thing. 2 wounds, held open in the warm light of the fire. Evelyn saw him then. Not a savior, not a captor, just a man, as broken as she was. An empathy, sharp and painful, bloomed in her chest. She had been sold. He had sold himself. The 3rd day, the storm had not broken, but the wind had quieted. A strange, suffocating intimacy had settled over the cabin. They had shared their truths. And now, in the silence, a new tension was growing. They were acutely aware of each other. The simple brush of his hand as he passed her a cup of coffee, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, every small movement was amplified in the confined space. "The wood is low," he announced, his voice abrupt. "And I need to check my snares. If I don't, the wolves will—" He bundled himself in his heavy bison hide coat, took his rifle from the rack, and pulled his hat low. "Keep the fire fed, and do not open the door. For any reason." He was gone. The heavy thud of the bar falling back into place on the other side of the door echoed in the room. Evelyn was alone, and for the first time, she was not afraid of the silence. She looked down at the ruined wedding dress. It was more than dirty. It was a symbol. It was the dress of her shame, of Silas Croft, of her own weakness. She could not bear to wear it another minute. He had a trunk at the foot of his cot. It was not locked. She hesitated. It was an invasion of his privacy, a privacy he clearly valued above all else. But the dress, she had to get it off. She knelt and opened the lid. Inside, it was neat. 2 pairs of wool trousers, a few flannel shirts, worn but clean, a whetstone, a small, leather-bound book. She touched nothing but the top shirt. It was dark green flannel, thick and soft. She pulled it out, along with a pair of trousers. They would be huge, but they would be clean. She heated water from the bucket of snowmelt he kept by the fire, poured it into the small tin basin. She took off the blanket and laid it on the cot. Then, with her back to the door, she faced the fire and began to unbutton the dress. The buttons were tiny, pearls, a cruel joke. Her fingers were still stiff. It took her long minutes to undo them. The heavy, damp silk slithered to the floor, pooling at her ankles in a white, pathetic heap. She stepped out of it and kicked it away. She was in her chemise and corset. The corset was the true prison. She reached behind her fingers fumbling with the laces. It was a hateful, complex thing. She worked at the knots, pulling, her breath coming in short, angry gasps until finally, the stays loosened and she could breathe. She tore it off and threw it on top of the dress. She stood in nothing but her thin cotton chemise, the firelight hot on her skin. She poured the warm water onto a rag and began to wash. The simple act of cleaning the grime from her neck, her arms, her face, feeling like a baptism. The heat of the fire on her back was a profound luxury. She did not hear the bar lift. She did not hear the door swing open. She only heard the sudden rush of cold air and the stomp of his boots. "The wind's picked up again," Callum said, his voice tight. "The snares were—" He stopped. Evelyn froze, her hand, holding the rag, halfway to her shoulder. He was standing in the doorway, snow on his shoulders, a brace of dead rabbits in his hand, and he was staring. She was silhouetted against the fire. The light shone directly through the thin, worn cotton of her chemise, revealing the perfect, clear outline of her body, the shadow between her breasts, the gentle curve of her hips, the long, pale line of her legs. Her dark hair was unbound, tumbling over her shoulders. For a full second, the world stopped. There was only the sound of the fire and the wind. Then Callum reacted. He turned his head away so sharply it looked painful. He fixed his gaze on the wall by the door, his face flushing a deep, dark red. "My apologies, ma'am," he said. His voice choked.
I did not. The snare line was empty. I came back sooner than I meant."
He did not move from the door, but he kept his back to her, presenting her with the wall of his shoulders. Evelyn's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She scrambled for the wool blanket, pulling it from the cot and wrapping it tight around her body, her hands shaking.
It is I who should be sorry,"
she whispered to his back.
"I did not expect you."
He nodded, still not looking.
"I will. Wait outside, until you are decent."
"No," she said, too quickly.
"Please, the storm. I am decent now."
He hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned. He kept his eyes carefully averted, looking at the floor as he crossed the room to hang the rabbits by the hearth. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the space of a patient and a caretaker. It was a tiny, enclosed box holding a man and a woman. The confessions had stripped them bare emotionally. The firelight had stripped her bare physically. There was nothing left to hide behind. The rest of the day was a study in profound, aching silence. He skinned the rabbits. She found a pot and began to make a stew, her movements stiff. When she needed the salt, which was on a shelf above his head, she simply pointed. He retrieved it, their fingers brushing as he handed her the tin. They both recoiled as if they had touched a hot coal. That night, the tension was a living thing. It was so thick she felt she could not breathe it. She lay on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, wearing his shirt and trousers underneath, the clothes smelling faintly of pine smoke and him. He did not go to his bedroll. He sat at the table, his back to her, and took out his knife. He picked up a piece of cured pine he had been saving, and he began to carve. Evelyn pretended to be asleep. She watched him through her lashes. The fire was burning low, the embers casting a deep red glow. His hands, which she knew to be strong enough to fell a tree or kill a man, moved with an almost impossible gentleness. The knife blade flashed, shaving off tiny, fragrant curls of wood. He worked for hours. The storm, as if exhausted, finally sighed into stillness. The only sounds were the shing of the knife and the settling of the logs in the fire. He worked until the shape was fully formed. He rubbed it with a small amount of grease from a tin, polishing it with a piece of worn deerskin until the wood grain shone. He stood, his tall frame unfolding in the dark. He walked to her cot. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, her heart stopping. She felt his presence beside her, a column of heat. He smelled of pine. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply bent and placed the object he had made on the small crate that served as her nightstand. Then he walked back to his own side of the room, lay down on his bedroll, and turned his back to her. She waited. She listened to the sound of his breathing, waiting for it to deepen into sleep. It did not. He was as awake as she was. Slowly, she reached out her hand in the dark. Her fingers brushed against the object. It was wood, impossibly smooth, and still warm from his hands. She picked it up. She held it in the faint light from the embers. It was a comb carved from a single piece, and the teeth were perfectly spaced and even. The handle was long and curved slightly, made to fit a woman's hand. It was simple. It was practical. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her hair had been a tangled, wild mess since the carriage crash. She had tried to finger comb it, but it was hopeless. Tears, hot and sudden, filled her eyes. It was not a gift of necessity, like the tea or the blanket. This was something else. This was a gesture of tenderness. It was an apology for staring. It was an acknowledgement of her as a woman. It was the first act of gentle, human kindness she had received in so long she could not remember. A small sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her throat. Across the room, Callum turned his head. In the deep shadows,
He could just make out her silhouette. Evelyn sat up. She let the blanket fall to her waist. She lifted the comb, the smooth wood feeling like a promise in her hand. She brought it to her hair. She started at the ends, as her mother had taught her, working gently, patiently, through the knots. The wooden teeth slid through, untangling, smoothing. She looked across the dark, silent cabin at the man on the floor. He was watching her. And for the first time since she could remember, Evelyn smiled. It was not a smile for a father, or a suitor, or a husband. It was not a smile of duty or fear. It was real. The storm did not end. It simply paused, gathered its strength, and began again. The world beyond the single and snow-caked window was no longer a landscape. It was a blank, white, and bottomless grave. The snow had piled in massive, undulating drifts that swallowed the pines, burying the world they knew under a dozen feet of silence. The wind had become a constant, low-pitched organ note that vibrated in the logs of the cabin, a sound so continuous it became part of their breathing. It had been 4 days, then 5, then 6. A new rhythm had taken root, born of pure necessity. It was the rhythm of a life they had not chosen, but one they now shared completely. They were a single, two-person animal, focused on the twin tasks of warmth and food. Callum would rise in the pre-dawn gray. The coldest part of the day, he would move with a predator's quiet, rebuilding the fire from its embers, his every motion economical. Evelyn, waking on the cot, would watch him through her lashes. He was a man made of quiet tensions. He would bundle himself in his layers of wool and his great bison coat, check his rifle, and slide a skinning knife into the sheath on his belt. He would nod to her, a brief, sharp acknowledgement. "Keep the fire high," he'd say, and then he would unbar the door. The opening of the door was a daily violence. It let in a gasp of blue, brutal cold, and a swirl of fine, dry snow. He would slip out into the white, a dark figure instantly consumed, and she would hear him strapping on the snowshoes he kept by the door. Then, silence. He was gone, hunting for anything that still moved in the frozen world. Her terror, in those hours, was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. She was terrified he would not return, that he would fall, or the storm would take him, and she would be left to starve, or freeze, or worse, be found. So she fought the fear with work. She became the keeper of the hearth. She fed the fire, log by precious log, guarding the flame as if it were her own soul. She melted snow for water. She scoured their few tins and plates with handfuls of coarse salt, making them gleam. She took stock of their provisions, her heart sinking with each count. The coffee was gone. The small bag of beans was empty. The flour sack was a limp, pale thing, with perhaps 2 days' worth of flour left in its bottom creases. The strip of salted venison hanging from the rafters was shrinking, a dark, hard punctuation mark against the log wall. They were, she calculated, perhaps 3 days from true starvation. They lived like a married couple, not a couple of love, or even of friendship, but a couple bound by the harsh, unspoken vows of survival. They moved around each other in the tiny space with a practiced, somber grace. He would return, half-frozen, sometimes with a rabbit, once with a lean, stringy grouse. He would nod, drop his kill on the table, and wordlessly, she would be ready with a cup of hot water, which was all they had left to offer. He would skin his kill, his hands sure and quick, while she prepared the pot. They ate their thin, watery stew in the evenings, sitting on opposite sides of the hearth. The silence, which had at first been a barrier, then a shared space of confession, was now something else. It was a domestic quiet, filled with the small sounds of living, the scrape of a spoon against a tin bowl, the sigh of the logs collapsing in the fire, the sound of his breathing in the dark. She wore his green flannel shirt every day. It was too large.
The sleeves rolled up a half-dozen times, but it was thick and warm, and it smelled of him: pine smoke, leather, and a faint, clean scent of cold air. She had washed her own ruined dress and underthings and hung them in a corner, where they froze solid, a white, ghostly reminder of the life she had barely escaped. She had come to know him by his sounds, the heavy, even tread of his boots on the floor, the way he would stop, mid-task, and listen to the wind, his head tilted, his senses reaching out beyond the walls. She knew the map of his face, the deep lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his beard was flecked with gray at the chin. He was, she thought, not an old man, but a man made old by things he would not speak of again. And he, in turn, watched her. He watched her comb her dark hair every morning with the wooden comb he had made. The simple, repetitive motion seemed to calm her. He watched the way she portioned their food, always giving him the slightly larger share. A quiet, stubborn insistence he had stopped arguing against. He saw the strength in her, but he also saw the fine, brittle thing beneath it, the thing that was close to shattering. The breaking came on the night of the 6th day. He had been gone longer than usual. The sun, a weak, pale disk, had already sunk, dragging the light from the world, and he was not back. Evelyn had paced the small floor, from the door to the hearth, back and forth, until she had made a path in the wood. The fear, the cold stone, was in her throat. When the bar finally lifted and he stumbled in, he was empty-handed. His face was gray with exhaustion, ice caked in his beard. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat. He slumped into the chair, pulling off his frozen gloves, his hands raw. "Not a track, not a sign. The world is empty." The finality of his words struck her harder than the cold. Empty. He had found nothing. She looked at the last, small handful of flour, at the single rabbit leg left from the day before. This was it. He saw her face. "I'll go further tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "Toward the ridge. There's cover there." "You'll kill yourself," she whispered. "We'll die if I don't." The flat, simple truth of it broke the last thread of her composure. He turned to the fire, exhausted, and began the slow work of warming his hands. Evelyn sat on the cot, her back to him. She felt a sudden, desperate need for something, a connection to the world she had lost, or the mother she had left. Her hand went to the pocket of the trousers he had given her. The letter was still there, a small, folded square of paper, warped and softened by the damp. It was the last thing her mother had pressed into her hand, just before the wedding, when they were alone for a moment. She unfolded it. It was not the first time she had read it. She knew the words by heart. But tonight, in the face of this new, final emptiness, the words were different. They were a judgment. "My dearest Evelyn, I write this with a heart that is broken. I look at you in that white dress, and I do not see a bride. I see the lamb I have led to slaughter. Your father. He is not a bad man. He is a weak one, and his weakness has cost you your life. I know you love the carpenter's boy. I saw it. I did nothing. I thought of our home, of our standing, of what we would lose. I was a coward. My daughter. I chose comfort over your happiness. And now this man, this Croft, he will take you, and I will have to live with the silence of your room. Forgive me. Forgive me for not being strong enough to save you." The tears came silently, but they were unstoppable. They were not for her fear, or for the cold, or the hunger. They were for her mother's weakness, which was her own. She had not fought. She had not screamed. She had walked to the altar, just as her mother had stood by and watched. They were two cowards, and this was their penance. She was crying into her hands, her shoulders shaking, trying to make no sound. Callum heard. The lack of sound was what he heard. The silence from her corner was too small.
too tight. He turned. He saw her back, her form curled in on itself, her shoulders shaking in that silent, agonizing way. He stood. He moved across the room, his weariness forgotten. He had spent his days keeping her fed, keeping her warm, keeping a physical distance. He had respected the invisible line between them. Now, he saw that line was meaningless. He stood over her for a long moment, his hand raised, hesitant. Then he laid it on her shoulder. His hand was huge, calloused, and still cold from the outside. But it was a touch. It was the first time he had touched her for any reason other than to save her life. At his touch, her control broke completely. A low, wounded sound tore from her throat. She turned, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide and undone. She looked up at him, this strange, sad man who had shared his secrets with her. "I'm tired," she whispered, the words ragged. "I'm so tired. I am so tired of being strong." It was the truest thing she had ever said. It was the surrender of her pride, her fear, her duty. Callum's face, etched with its own grief, softened. He saw his own brokenness reflected in her. He did not speak. He did not offer hollow words of comfort. He simply sank to his knees in front of her, and, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he put his arms around her. He pulled her from the cot and into his embrace. He held her against his chest, his arms encircling her completely. He was so large he enveloped her. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, which was damp with melted snow. She cried. She wept for her lost love, for her souled future, for Jed bleeding in the snow, for her weak mother, and for the man whose arms were now holding her, a man as damned as she was. He just held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his eyes closed. He let her grief wash over them both. It was a comfort, at first, a purely human gesture, the solace of warmth in a world of ice. He was a man starved of touch. She was a woman starved of kindness. But a line was crossed. Slowly, her sobs quieted, her breathing hitched, steadied, and she became aware, as he did, of exactly where she was. She was pressed against the entire length of him. She could feel the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her cheek. She could smell the cold, clean scent of him. Her arms, which had been trapped between them, were now wrapped around his waist. Her hands splayed against the muscles of his back. He became aware of the shape of her, the slimness of her back beneath his hands, the softness of her hair against his chin, the faint, warm, womanly scent of her skin beneath the smell of wood smoke. He loosened his grip. She did not pull away. She just tilted her head back, looking up at him. Her face was inches from his. Her eyes, still wet, were dark and deep. Her lips, chapped and pale, were parted. He looked at her, and the whole world contracted to the small, fire-lit space between their faces. The hunger he felt was no longer for food. It was a vast, aching void he had ignored for 3 years. It was a need so deep it terrified him. He lowered his head. It was a slow, hesitant movement, a question. She did not move. She did not breathe. She just watched him, her eyes fixed on his. His lips touched hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not soft. It was chapped lips against chapped lips. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the cold from his skin. It was desperate. It was a drowning man's first breath. It was a kiss of shared grief, of profound loneliness, of 2 people at the absolute end of their rope. And then it changed. His hand moved from her back, cupping the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He deepened the kiss, and it was no longer about comfort. It was about want. It was a raw, undeniable claiming. Evelyn's hands, which had been resting on his back, gripped his shirt. A fire, one that had nothing to do with the hearth, exploded in her belly.
It was a heat that spread through her limbs, a sudden, shocking flood of life in a place that had been frozen. She kissed him back, with all the pent-up fear and rage and loneliness of her 19 years. It was Callum who broke it. He tore his mouth from hers, breathing hard, his whole body shaking. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. "No," he rasped, his voice a low growl of self-loathing. "I can't." He pulled back, getting to his feet, putting distance between them. He stood over her, his hands clenched into fists. "I won't," he said, his back to her. "I won't be that man. You're another man's wife. You're terrified. You're not thinking, I will not take advantage of you. I'm not him." He was protecting her. From himself. From the man he had been, the man who had stood by, the man who was capable of terrible things. Evelyn looked at him. She saw his back, the rigid line of his spine. She saw his hands, clenched in a fight against his own nature, and she felt not fear but a sudden, piercing clarity. This was the first real choice she had ever been given. Her father had sold her. Silas had bought her. The storm had trapped her. But this man, this broken, guilty, good man, was giving her a choice. He was offering her the respect of her own will. She stood up from the floor. She was not crying anymore. She felt calm, her body thrumming with a power she had never known she possessed. She walked up behind him. She laid her hand flat on the center of his back. He flinched, but he did not move away. "I am tired of being strong," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I am not weak." He turned, slowly, to face her. His eyes were tormented. "Evelyn," he began, "you don't know." "I know," she said, cutting him off. "I know that I was sold. I know that I am, by law, that man's property. I know that if we leave this cabin, I will be dragged back to him." She stepped closer, until she was standing in his shadow. "I also know that in here, in this place, with you, I am just a woman, and you are just a man." She raised her hand, slowly, and laid it on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it hammering like a trapped bird. "He bought my duty," she whispered. "He does not own my body, and he will never, ever own this." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unflinching, stripping away his guilt, his protests. "Take it off," she whispered. Callum's breath hitched. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "Take it off." She tugged at the lapel of his heavy wool shirt. "I am cold, and I want to feel your skin. I want, for one night, to be human." He searched her face, looking for any sign of coercion, of fear, of delirium. He found none. He found only a woman who was as lost as he was, but who, in this one defining moment, was braver. She was choosing him. He looked at her for a long, timeless second. Then he looked past her, at the cabin door. Outside, the wind, which had been still, was beginning to rise again, a low, mournful sound. The world was reminding them of its presence. Callum reached out, not for her, but for the door. He walked past her, his movement heavy, deliberate. He lifted the massive wooden bar and dropped it into its iron brackets. The thud was a sound of finality, a sound of separation, shutting out the world, shutting out Silas Croft, shutting out the past. He turned back to her. The cabin was lit only by the low, pulsing red of the embers. He was a mountain of shadow, his face unreadable. He did not come to her. He waited. Evelyn walked to him. She stood before him and, with hands that did not shake, she began to unbutton his shirt. The wool was thick, the buttons stiff. He did not move. He just watched her, his breathing heavy in the silence. She pushed the shirt off his shoulders. It fell to the floor.
The firelight played on the hard muscles of his chest, on the old white scars. He was built like the trees outside, solid, rooted, and weathered. Then his hands came up. His touch was hesitant, his calloused, rough fingers brushed her cheek, as if checking to see if she were real. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. He unbraided her hair, his movement slow, almost clumsy, but gentle. He ran his hands through the long, tangled waves, spreading it over her shoulders. He lifted her then in one easy motion, as he had the first day. But this time, it was not to save her. He carried her not to the cot, but to the bearskin rug before the fire, the warmest place in the cabin. He laid her down. He did not cover her. He knelt beside her. They were in the silence of wood, and snow, and fire. There was no pretense. There was no hurry. He undressed her, slowly, as if unwrapping something precious. The flannel shirt, the rough trousers, his own clothes, given back to him. And then it was just skin. His touch was shy at first, a mapping of this new, strange territory. A hand on her hip, a kiss on her shoulder. She was so pale against the dark fur of the rug, her skin glowing in the embers. She was not the frail, perfect doll of Silas Croft. She was a woman, thin from hunger, but alive, and warm, and trembling beneath his hands. She was just as hesitant. She touched the scars on his chest. She ran her hand over the hard, corded muscle of his arm. She was not afraid. For the first time, she was not afraid. It was not a joining of passion. At first, it was a joining of truth. It was awkward and fumbling and honest. It was two people remembering how to be human. And then, as the wind howled its jealousy outside, it became something else. The hesitation burned away. The loneliness became a bridge. The quiet grief became a fierce, desperate passion. It was a claiming, a mutual, silent, desperate claiming, a rebellion against the cold, against the world, against the men who had tried to break them. It was a spark of life, struck in the deepest, darkest heart of winter. Afterward, they did not speak. They lay tangled together on the rug, covered by his heavy bison coat. The fire had burned down to a dull, red eye. The cabin was cold, but they were not. Callum held her, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her waist. She lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady drum of his heart beneath her ear. He was the first to move. He tucked the coat more tightly around her shoulders. She looked up at him in the darkness. They were closer than two people could be. They had shared their bodies, their pasts, their deepest fears. And yet, as the first faint, gray light of morning began to creep through a crack in the shutters, the silence was heavy with a new, shared dread. E-Button looked toward the window. The storm was over. The wind was gone. There was only silence. The world outside was waiting. She thought of Silas Croft. She thought of the search parties. She thought of the town, the law, the man she had married. And she was no longer just afraid for herself. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had hidden from the world for 3 years. She had, with her own choice, dragged him back into it. The consequences of this night, of this warmth, would not just be hers to bear. They would be his too. And she knew, with a certainty that was as cold as the snow, that the world would show them no mercy. The morning came with a cruel, blinding beauty. The storm had passed, leaving the world newborn and crystallized. Sunlight, something they had not seen in nearly a week, streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the 7th day. They had dressed in silence. The intimacy of the night before had not vanished. It had solidified, becoming an awkward, heavy thing that settled between them. They were no longer strangers, but they were not lovers. They were something else, something unnamed, and the newness of it was sharp and frightening. He had given her the last of the flower.
which she'd made into a small, flat, tasteless bread on the hearthstone. They were eating it, sharing the last piece, when the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a man's voice, shouting, the sound carrying with an unnatural clarity in the cold, still air. Callum froze. His head snapped up, his body tensing like a wire. He was not looking at her. He was listening, his gaze fixed on the cabin door, his senses reaching out into the white. Another shout, closer. Then, the jingle of harness and the crunch of many feet on crusted snow. "Get your things," he said, his voice a low, flat command. "All of them." Evelyn's heart stopped. She scrambled to the cot, grabbing the wooden comb, her hands shaking. "Who is it?" "It doesn't matter. Get your things." He moved to the wall, taking his rifle from its rack. He checked the load, his movements economical and sure. He was no longer the tender, hesitant man of the night before. He was the man who had survived alone for 3 years. A heavy, gloved fist hammered on the door. "Hello, the cabin? Anyone in there?" Callum looked at Evelyn. His eyes were cold, assessing. He pointed to the floor, at the bearskin rug where they had lain. "The rug, move it." Evelyn scrambled to obey, pulling the heavy fur aside. Underneath were thick, rough-hewn floorboards. A small, knotted rope was recessed into one of them. Callum jammed his fingers into the loop and pulled. A square section of the floor lifted, revealing a dark, shallow hole. It was a root cellar, smelling of damp earth and potatoes. "Get in," he commanded. Callum. "Now, Evelyn, and you do not make a sound, not for any reason. You do not exist. Do you understand me?" She nodded, tears of terror stinging her eyes. She dropped into the hole. It was barely 3 feet deep. She crouched in the cold, earthen dark. Callum placed the trapdoor back over her head, plunging her into blackness. She heard him drag the bearskin rug back into place. The hammering on the door came again, harder this time, rattling the latch. "I know you're in there, old man. We saw the smoke. Open this door, or we'll open it for you." Evelyn heard Callum's heavy boots cross the floor. She heard the sound of the thick wooden bar being lifted. The door groaned open, letting in a rush of cold air and loud, male voices. "Took you long enough," a gruff voice said. "What, you deaf?" "Just slow," Callum's voice replied, flat and deep. "We're looking for someone. A woman." The voice was closer now. Evelyn held her breath, pressing her face against the cold dirt. She could hear the heavy steps of at least 2 men as they entered the cabin. They were directly above her. "A woman?" Callum said. "Haven't seen one of those in 3 years." "Don't play dumb. We tracked a carriage. Wrecked about 2 miles north of here. Driver's dead. Broke his neck. But the woman's gone. Tracks were spotty." "But they led this way before the last blow." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Jed, he was dead." She put a hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that rose in her throat. "The tracks lead everywhere." Callum said, "Snow fools a man. This woman ain't just any woman." The main speaker's voice had a nasal, cruel edge. Evelyn recognized it. Harlan, Silas Croft's foreman, a man whose face was a map of meanness. "She's Silas Croft's new wife, run off on her wedding day. He's paying $100, gold, for her return, safe or otherwise." A silence stretched. Evelyn could feel the tension in the small room above her. $100, Harlan repeated, his voice oily. "That's a lot of money for a hermit. All you gotta do is tell us where she is." "I told you," Callum said. "There's no one here, just me." "You're a liar." Harlan's boot heel struck the floorboard just inches from Evelyn's head. She flinched, biting down on her glove. "We know you're in here, Mrs. Croft. Silas is a forgiving man, but he don't like being made a fool of. You come out now. We'll make sure he goes easy on you." The silence was absolute. Evelyn prayed he could not hear the hammering of her heart.
"What's under the rug, old man?"
Harlan's voice was sharp. A floor. Evelyn heard a scraping sound. He was kicking the rug aside. Her world, her dark, safe hole, was about to be ripped open.
"Harlan, look at this,"
another voice said, from the far side of the cabin.
"Over here, in the corner."
Evelyn heard Harlan's boots move away.
Well, what do we have here?"
Harlan's voice was laced with triumph.
"That don't look like your laundry, hermit."
Evelyn's stomach twisted. The dress, her wedding dress. She had washed it and hung it in the darkest corner, where it had frozen. She had forgotten.
"That's a woman's dress, ain't it?"
Harlan sneered.
"A fancy one, too. You been having parties, old man?"
Callum said nothing.
"Where is she?"
Harlan's voice was a snarl.
"You got her hidden? You been having your way with her? Silas'll hang you for that. He'll hang you slow."
"It's my wife's," Callum said, his voice unchanged. This stopped Harlan.
"Your what?"
"My wife's, from before. She's been dead 6 years." The lie was so sudden, so profound, it hung in the air. Evelyn pictured his face, the deep grief he held, and how easily he had summoned it to use as a shield. Harlan spat on the floor.
"You're lying. We're tearing this place apart. Jeb, check the loft."
"There's no loft," Callum said.
"Then check under the bed. Check everywhere. She's here. I can smell her."
Evelyn heard them. Tins being swept from shelves, the cot being overturned, the chair scraping as it was thrown. They were destroying the small, quiet world that had saved her. "What's under the floor? I asked you," Harlan said, his voice low and dangerous. He was back, standing over her. "A root cellar," Callum said.
"Open it. There's nothing but spiders and half-rotted potatoes."
"I said, open it." Callum sighed, a long, slow sound of weary compliance. "As you wish." Evelyn heard him grab the rope loop. The trapdoor lifted, a rectangle of gray. Dusty light fell upon her. She was exposed. She looked up, past the dark, crouching shape of Callum, and saw Harlan's face, grinning in triumph.
"Well, hello there, little mouse,"
Harlan said. He reached down a gloved hand.
"Come on out, Mrs. Croft. The game is over."
Evelyn stared, frozen. Then Callum moved. He did not move toward Harlan. He moved toward the door, in one swift, fluid motion. He was between the two men and the exit. He held his rifle, not pointing it, but holding it across his chest. A barrier. "She's not going," Callum said. Harlan's grin vanished.
"What did you say?"
"I said, she's not going. You've had your look. Now get out of my cabin." Harlan and the other man, Jeb, looked at each other. Then Harlan laughed. A short, ugly bark. "You're a brave man, old-timer. A stupid one, but brave. There are 2 of us, 1 of you, and she's coming with us." "No," Callum said. Harlan's hand went to the pistol on his hip. "I don't want to kill you, but Silas wants her back. He wasn't particular about how—" "And if you shoot me," Callum said, his voice still calm, "the sound will bring a slide down from that north ridge. The snow's heavy. You'll be buried with us. You'll never get her back to town. You'll never see that $100. He was bluffing, or was he? The silence that followed was heavy. Harlan looked out the door, up at the towering, snow-laden mountain that loomed over the cabin. The silence of the new snow was absolute. A single shot would echo like thunder. "You're crazy," Jeb whispered, his hand nervously on his own gun. "Maybe," Callum said. "But I've got nothing to lose. You do now. Take your hands off your guns and walk out. Slowly." Harlan stared at him. His eyes narrowed, calculating. He was measuring the distance. He was measuring Callum's resolve. He saw something in Callum's eyes, something dead and final, and it made him hesitate. "This ain't over," Harlan spat, taking his hand away from his pistol. "Silas will hear about this. He'll send a dozen men. He'll burn this shack to the ground with you in it." "Maybe he will," Callum said. "But not today. Today, you're leaving." Harlan gave Evelyn one last, hateful look. "You'll regret this, ma'am. He'll make you wish you died in that carriage." He backed out of the door, Jeb following him. Their eyes locked on Callum's rifle. Callum watched them go, his face an unreadable mask. They mounted their horses, shouting curses. Callum stood in the doorway until the sound of their riding had faded completely into the vast, white silence. He turned, barred the door, and let his rifle rest against the wall. He looked at Evelyn, who was still crouched in the dark, cold whole. He offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her up in one strong, easy motion. She stumbled out onto the floor, covered in dirt, shaking so badly she could not stand. She collapsed onto the bearskin rug. The panic, held back for so long, finally broke. It was not a scream. It was a low, animal sound of pure terror. "They'll be back," she choked, rocking back and forth. "They'll come back. Oh, God, they'll kill you. They'll hang you. He said they would. They'll kill you. All because of me. Evelyn." He knelt in front of her, grabbing her shoulders. His grip was hard, painful. "Stop it. Breathe." "No, you don't understand. You don't know him. He'll send them back. He'll send them all. You saved me, and I've killed you. I have to go. I have to leave. I can tell them I ran away, that you didn't help me." "Be quiet." His voice was a slap. "You're not thinking. You're not going anywhere. You'd be dead in an hour." "It's better than you being dead," she screamed at him, her voice cracking. "I can't be the reason. I can't have your death on my hands, too." "My death?" He stood up, his face suddenly dark with an anger she had not seen. "You think I care about that?" He kicked the overturned cot, the wood slamming against the wall. "You think this is about me? What do you think last night was? A game? A way to pass the storm?" Evelyn stared at him, stunned into silence by his fury. "What? No, I don't—" "You stand there," he seethed. "And you tell me you're going to walk out that door. You tell me you're going to give yourself back to him. After what we are, you think so little of me? You think so little of us?" The word hung in the air. "Us." "It's not about us," she cried, the tears streaming down her face. "There is no us out there. Us was a dream. Us was the storm. Out there, in the world. I am his property. And you are a thief, and they will hang you for it. Don't you see? I'm not running from you. I'm trying to save you." "You're a coward," he shot back, the words like stones. "You're running, just like you were running from him." "I am not a coward." "Then stay," he roared. "Stay and fight. But you want to run? You want to go back and be his property, because it's easier than standing on your own 2 feet. The accusation hit her. It was so cruel, so unfair, that it stole her breath. He did not understand. He did not see the terror, the reality of Silas Croft, a man who crushed whatever he could not own. "You're wrong," she whispered, her voice dead. "You are wrong." She turned away from him. The argument was over. He had not seen her sacrifice. He had only seen her fear. They did not speak for the rest of the day. The silence in the cabin was a new kind of cold, a cold far worse than the storm. He righted the furniture, his movements sharp and angry. She sat on the cot, her arms wrapped around her knees, and stared into the fire. He had called her a coward, and perhaps he was right. Night fell. He did not light the lamp. He did not build up the fire. He lay on his bedroll by the door, his back to her, a rigid, unmoving line of rejection. Evelyn lay on the cot, her heart a small, cold stone. He was right.
She was a coward. She had been a coward with Thomas. She had been a coward at the altar. And she was a coward now. But her cowardice was not for herself. It was for him. He, who had lived in peace, was now a marked man. She was a disease, and she had infected him. She waited. She waited for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing. It never deepened into true sleep. He was awake, just as she was. But finally, near the blackest hour of the morning, his breathing evened out, a long, slow rhythm. She slipped from the cot. Her movements were silent. She could not take his clothes. That would be another theft. She went to the corner where her own things hung, stiff and frozen. Her wedding dress, her traveling cloak. It was thin, but it was hers. She took down the cloak. She put on her own frozen boots, her feet screaming in protest. She took the last piece of the hard bread from the table. She looked at the wooden comb. She left it. She could take nothing of his. She went to the door. Her hand was on the bar. It was heavy. She lifted it, the wood scraping, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silence. She froze. She looked at his form on the floor. He did not move. She slipped out the door, pulling it shut behind her. She did not bar it. The world was achingly beautiful. The moon was a sliver of ice, but the stars were a brilliant, burning spray across the black sky. The snow was a sea of diamonds, blue and white in the moonlight. And the cold was a physical thing. It was a presence, an entity that reached into her lungs and squeezed. She began to walk. She did not know where. She just walked, away from the cabin, away from the man she had ruined. She did not get far, maybe a quarter of a mile. The snow was deep, with a hard crust that sometimes held her weight and sometimes betrayed her, plunging her waist deep into the freezing powder. Her cloak was useless. The cold found every seam, every opening. Her feet were numb. Then her legs. She stumbled. She fell into a deep drift, the snow soft as a feather bed. She was so tired. The argument had taken the last of her strength. She looked up at the stars. They were beautiful. It would be a peaceful way to die. She remembered her thought from the carriage. God had answered her, just a little late. She closed her eyes. She did not hear him coming. He was not wearing a coat. He had not stopped for his rifle. He had only pulled on his boots. He had known, the moment she'd lifted the bar, what she was doing. He had given her a head start, his heart a raging war between his anger and his terror. He found her by the track of her foolish, small boots. She was curled in the snowdrift, her face pale blue in the starlight, a dusting of frost already on her eyelashes. "Evelyn!" His voice was a raw sound, not a name, but a plea. He fell to his knees beside her, grabbing her. She was limp. Her skin was so cold. "No," he whispered. "No, not you, not again. I will not let you." He scooped her up. She was a frozen, terrifying lightweight in his arms. He turned and ran back to the cabin, his bare-chested upper body exposed to the sub-zero air. He did not feel it. He felt nothing but the cold radiating from her body. He kicked the door open, slammed it shut, and barred it. He did not put her down. He carried her to the fire, throwing log after log onto the embers, desperate for a blaze. He laid her on the bearskin rug. He tore the frozen cloak from her body. He pulled the frozen boots from her feet. Her skin was white, waxy. He grabbed every blanket he owned. He wrapped her in them, piling them high. It was not enough. He was not getting through the cold. He sat on the rug and pulled her into his lap, wrapping the blankets around them both. He held her against his bare chest, trying to force his own life, his own heat, into her frozen limbs. He rubbed her hands between his own skin burning from the friction. "Come back," he whispered, his voice broken. "Damn you, Evelyn! You come back! Don't you leave me!" He held her tightly, rocking her in the firelight, his face buried in her cold, damp hair. And he, who had not wept for the family he'd watched die,
who had not wept for his own lost soul. He wept. He did not know he was doing it. It was just a silent, hot stream of failure and terror, his tears falling onto her face, freezing there. He was losing her. He had found her, and he was losing her. She woke to warmth and to the sound of a man's weeping. It was a strange, raw, choked sound. She was on his lap, held so tightly she could barely breathe. The fire was a roaring inferno in front of them. She felt his tears, hot on her temple. She felt his body shaking with the force of his sobs. "Callum?" Her voice was a dry, thin croak. He stiffened. His sobbing stopped, hitched. He pulled back, his face a wreck of grief and relief. His eyes were red, his face streaked. You're warm," he stammered, his hand on her cheek, his rough thumb brushing away the tears. His own. I'm sorry," she whispered, her own tears starting to flow, warm and easy. "I'm so sorry. Callum, I wasn't running from you. I was trying to save you. I just wanted you to be left in peace." He looked at her, his expression raw. "Peace," he said, his voice thick. "There is no peace. Not for me, not anymore." He pulled her closer, his grip desperate. "There is no peace without you." The admission hung between them, the final, undeniable truth. She looked at him, her heart aching. "But Silas, Harlan, they'll be back." "I know." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his control returning, his face hardening into a new resolve. "I've spent 3 years hiding from the ghost of a little girl I let die. I've been running. You were right to call me a coward." "No," she whispered. "Yes, but I am done running. He said, the name Silas, a curse, is just a man. He is flesh and blood, and he will not have you." Evelyn looked into his eyes, and she saw the fear was still there. But beneath it was something new, something hard as iron. "What do we do?" she asked. He held her face between his two big hands. We wait for the snow to thaw. We wait for the path to clear. We eat the last of what we have. We get our strength." "And then," she whispered. "We run?" He shook his head. "No more running. Not for either of us." He looked into her eyes, his gaze steady. "Absolute. We will walk out of here. Together. We will walk right back into that town. You will face him. You will tell your truth. And I," he said, his voice dropping, "will stand right beside you. I will not let him, or any man, touch you again." She stared at him. The plan was madness. It was suicide. But as she looked at his face, at the certainty there, she felt something she had not felt in her entire life. She felt safe. She nodded. A single, slow movement. Together. They sat by the fire for the rest of the night. He did not let her go. They did not make love. They just held on. Two soldiers in a foxhole, having survived the first shelling, waiting for the dawn, and preparing for the war that was to come. The thaw was a slow, agonizing miracle. For 3 days after the search party, they had lived on the last scraps of their food, their hunger a constant, shared ache. Then the world began to drip. The heavy, oppressive silence of the snow was broken by the sound of running water, the crack of ice, the heavy sigh of snow sliding from the pines. The path, however treacherous, was opening. They waited 2 more days, gathering what was left of their strength. They were gaunt, their faces hollowed, but their eyes were clear. The night before they left, he had taken her hand by the firelight. He'd said nothing. He'd just held it. It was a promise. The walk back was a trial. The snow was a wet, heavy slurry that pulled at their boots. The world was a mess of mud and slush. They moved slowly, Callum ahead, his long legs breaking the trail, Evelyn following in his footsteps. They did not speak. They saved their breath for the climb. It took them the better part of a day to reach the ridge overlooking the town. They stood there for a moment, Looking down, it was a small, gray smudge in the vast, white valley. The bell in the church spire was ringing, a thin, cold sound in the air.
"It's Sunday,"
Evelyn said, her voice a dry rasp. "They will all be there," Callum said. He looked at her, his face grim. "Are you certain? We can still turn. We can go north, to the high territories. They would never find us." She shook her head.
"No, no more running.
She looked at the church.
That is where it began.
"It must end there." He nodded. "Once. This is your fight. Evelyn, I will be with you, but you must be the one to speak." They walked down from the foothills. As they reached the first house on the edge of town, a dog began to bark. A frantic, high-pitched sound. A man came out onto his porch, holding a cup of coffee. He saw them, and the cup dropped from his hand, shattering on the boards. "Sweet Mary," he whispered. They walked down the center of the main street. The mud was deep, sucking at their boots. People stopped. They came out of the general store, out of the saloon. Their Sabbath drinking interrupted. They stared. They were seeing two ghosts. The woman was Evelyn Croft, the bride who had vanished into the blizzard, now returned from the dead. She was not in her wedding dress. She was in the rough, oversized clothes of a man. Her dark hair was matted, her face so thin it was almost a skull, but her eyes were alive, burning with a feverish light. And the man beside her, they knew him, too, Callum, the hermit of the high ridge, the man who had vanished 3 years ago after the incident at the river. He was a wild thing, gaunt and bearded, his clothes ragged, but he walked with a deadly, quiet purpose. The whispers followed them like a wave. "It's her, alive, and him? God in heaven, what has happened?" Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the small white church at the end of the street. She heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart. She reached the church doors. Callum stopped at the steps. "Go," he said. "I am right behind you." She put her hand on the wooden door and pushed. It swung open with a low, heavy creak. The hymn died. The small pump organ, played by Mrs. Gable, let out a dying, wheezing note. Reverend Miles, his hands raised in blessing, froze, his mouth open. The entire town was in those pews. They all turned, they all stared. And in the front pew, the one paid for by his generous donations, sat Silas Croft. He was dressed in his fine black Sunday suit. When he saw her, his face, the color of old paper, went a dark, mottled red. It was not shock. It was not relief. It was the sudden, cold fury of an owner who sees his prized possession returned, scratched and muddied. Beside him sat Evelyn's father, who seemed to shrink into his own coat, his face ashen. "Evelyn," Reverend Miles stammered, his hands dropping to his sides. We thought, child, we believed you were dead." "You were wrong, Reverend," Evelyn said. Her voice was not loud, but in the sanctified silence. It carried to the back row. It was a raw, cracked voice, thin from hunger, but it did not tremble. She walked down the center aisle. The floorboards creaked under her boots. She felt the weight of their eyes, the 100 silent questions, the judgment. She walked past her father, who would not meet her gaze. She stopped 10 feet from the altar, 10 feet from her husband. "Evelyn," Silas said, rising slowly from the pew. His voice was a low, possessive growl. He was trying to control his rage. "You have caused an absolute panic. The whole county has been searching. Where have you been?" "I have been surviving," Evelyn said. She turned, not to him, but to the preacher. "Reverend Miles, I have come to annul a marriage." The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. A collective. Sharp intake of breath swept the station. Annulment. It was a word spoken only in whispers. A word of profound shame. "Annul?"
the preacher said, taking a step back. My dear, I do not understand. The vow was taken, in this very house, before God. The vow was a lie, Evelyn said. She turned to face the crowd, the sea of familiar faces that had watched her be sacrificed. The entire marriage was a lie. It was not a union. It was a transaction. This is blasphemy, Mrs. Gable hissed from the organ bench. This is the truth, Evelyn replied. She looked at her father. He was shaking, his eyes fixed on the floor. Father, tell them the truth. Her father winced, but did not look up. He said nothing. He cannot, Evelyn said, her voice clear and cold, filled not with anger, but with a terrible, final pity. He is a weak man, and he is afraid. But I am not any more. She turned her burning gaze on Silas Croft. My father owed you $5,000. A gambling debt, a whiskey debt, a debt he could never repay. This is a private matter, Silas snapped. It stopped being a private matter when you took me as payment. Evelyn's voice rose, ringing against the rafters. I was sold. I was barter. My life, my body, for his debt. This was not a marriage. It was slavery. She is hysterical, Silas roared, appealing to the crowd. She was lost in the storm. Her mind is broken. My mind, Evelyn said, has never been clearer. And who? A new voice sneered from the back of the church. It was Harlan, the foreman, standing by the door. Who is that? The church doors were still open, and filling the frame, a dark silhouette against the bright, snowy morning. Was Callum? He was bare-handed. His rifle was not with him. He walked into the church. The sound of his heavy, worn boots on the holy floor was a desecration. He walked down the aisle, the crowd parting for him as if he were a leper. He did not look at them. He did not look at the preacher. He looked only at Evelyn. He came to a stop beside her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just stood, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man, challenging the entire room. Callum, someone whispered in horror. The hermit. Silas Croft's face lit with a cold, triumphant understanding. He smiled, a thin, cruel, reptilian smile. So, he said, his voice dropping to a soft, venomous purr. The truth is finally revealed. Not a lost lamb, after all. A runaway, an adulteress, a harlot, stealing away with a wild man. The room erupted. The whispers were now an angry, righteous buzz. Adultery. The word was poison. She took a vow. Mrs. Gable cried, finding her voice. Before God, she belongs to her husband. We all knew it was wrong. A man's voice called from the back. We all knew Croft had him by the throat. It was no proper marriage. It was a legal one, Silas shouted. She is mine, by the law of this territory, and by the law of God. You, Silas snarled, turning his full, purple-faced fury on Callum. You animal, you filthy poacher, you found her, you forced her, you stole my wife. Rage made him strong. He was not a young man, but he was powerful. He lunged, not with a fist, but with the heavy, silver-topped cane he always carried. He raised it high, to bring it crashing down on Callum's skull. Evelyn cried out. Callum did not move. He did not flinch. He did not raise a hand to defend himself. He just stood, his eyes open, watching the blow come. It never landed. Callum's hands shot up, faster than any man in that room could believe. He did not strike back. He simply caught the cane in his massive, calloused hand, stopping it an inch from his face. The sound of his grip enclosing the wood was a dull thud. Silas stared, his arm still raised, his hand still on the cane. He pulled. It did not move. It was as if he were trying to pull a tree from the earth. Let her speak. It was the first time Callum had spoken. His voice was a low, deep rumble, like stones moving under water. It was not a request.
Silas tugged again, his face a mask of straining fury. Callum wrenched the cane from his grasp and threw it to the floor. It clattered on the stone flags. Loud in the sudden silence,
"She is a liar,"
Silas spat, breathing hard.
"A whore."
"She is done being silent," Callum said. He turned his gaze, his dark, quiet, unsettling gaze, from Silas to Reverend Miles. "You are a man of God. You will listen to her truth, or is your God as bought and paid for as the rest of this town?" The preacher recoiled as if struck. Evelyn stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of Callum. "He is right. I am done being silent, and I am done being afraid." She looked at the crowd, at the men and women who had known her since she was a child. "You all sat here. You watched me. You pitied me. I saw your eyes. You knew this was wrong. You knew a 19-year-old girl was being sacrificed. And you said nothing." She turned back to Silas, her husband. "You are right, Mr. Croft. I am your wife, by your law, and by that same law. I am an adulteress." A new, sharper gasp. She had admitted it. This was not an accusation. It was a confession. "And this man?" She laid her hand on Callum's arm, a clear, possessive, defiant touch. "Is my partner in that sin? I will not lie. Not anymore." Her voice rose, gaining strength with every word. "I was lost. I was freezing. I was dying. This man found me. He brought me to his cabin. He gave me warmth. He gave me medicine. He saved my life. Harlan and his men came. He turned them away. He protected me."
"He stole you,"
Silas roared. "He saved me," Evelyn roared back, her voice cracking. "From the storm, and from you, and yes, in that cabin, starving and trapped, I found a life I had never known. I found a man who treated me not as property, but as a person. I chose him. I chose him then, and I choose him now." She faced the preacher, her chin high. "If your law says I must be punished for choosing to live, then punish me. If your God says I must be stoned for choosing love over a contract, then find the first stone." Her voice dropped, but lost none of its iron. "But I will not go back to that man. I would rather be dead." The church was in chaos. Men were on their feet. Mrs. Gable was calling for the sheriff. Silas was demanding Callum be arrested for theft, for kidnapping, for adultery. The sheriff, a man named Bates, looked helpless. He was standing in the back, his hand on his gun, but he looked at Silas, and then at Callum, and then at Evelyn, and he did not move. Then, a new voice cut through the noise. It was not loud, it was quiet, but it was heavy with an authority that silenced the room. "She is right." All heads turned. Sarah Polson stood up from her pew in the back. She was a widow, a woman in her 40s who had buried a brutal, drunken husband 5 years before. She wore her plain black dress, her face lined with a grief that had never left her. She walked down the aisle. She did not stop until she was standing on the other side of Evelyn. "She is right," Sarah said again, her voice shaking, but clear. She looked at the preacher. "I was married in this church, at 16, to a man my father owed money to. A good man, everyone said, a pillar of the community." She turned to the crowd. "He was a monster. He beat me. He broke me. He did it for 21 years. And when I came to you, Reverend, when I came to you with a broken jaw, what did you tell me?" Reverend Miles's face went white. "You told me to endure," Sarah said, her voice a low, burning fire. "You told me it was my wifely duty. You told me my suffering was God's will, that my reward would be in heaven." She turned and took Evelyn's hand. "This child? She has found more courage in 1 week than I found in 20 years. She has chosen not to endure. She has chosen to live, right now, in this world, not the next." Sarah Polson, the quiet, beaten widow, looked at the crowd, at the men and women who had whispered about her for 2 decades. Her eyes were blazing. "If you are looking for stones, you will start with me." A tremor went through the room. The tide had turned. It was not a flood, but it was a crack in the dam. An old rancher, who owed Silas a great deal of money, stood up. "She's right, Sarah. We all knew. We just kept quiet." Another woman, then another, stood in solidarity. Silas Croft looked around. He saw his power, the power built on debt and fear, wavering. It was not gone, but for the first time, it was not absolute. He looked at the sheriff, but Bates pointedly looked away. Reverend Miles was trapped. He looked at Silas, his patron, his face a mask of purple rage. He looked at Evelyn, her face pale but resolute. He looked at Callum, who was watching him with a quiet, terrible judgment. And he looked at Sarah Polson, who was the living embodiment of his own failure as a shepherd. He wrung his hands. He licked his lips. The laws of God, the laws of man, they are clear," he stammered. "A vow is a vow, but—" He looked at Sarah's blazing eyes. "But Mrs. Polson is also right," he said, the words tasting like ash. The church cannot condone a union, forced by debt. No man has the right to force another human being into bondage. This is a matter for the territorial courts, not for the house of God." It was a coward's retreat. It was not a victory, it was an abdication. But it was enough. He was washing his hands of it. He was giving Silas no divine, and no moral, authority to drag her home. Silas knew he was beaten. For today, in this room, he could not, in front of the entire town, after the preacher's words, lay hands on her. His eyes, as they met Evelyn's, promised a cold, slow, and terrible revenge. Evelyn did not flinch. She looked at Callum. He nodded. Once, it was over. She turned her back on her husband. She turned her back on the altar, and on the preacher. She did not look at her father. She took Callum's hand. Hand in hand, they walked down the center aisle. The townsfolk, standing, watched them. They parted, a silent, staring sea of judgment and pity, and a new, strange, and terrifying respect. They walked out of the church. They did not run. They walked. They stepped out into the cold, bright, muddy sunlight. They walked past the general store. They walked past the saloon. They walked past the last house on the edge of town. Together, in silence, they walked away from the world of men and toward the vast, empty, and free promise of the mountains. They did not go back to his cabin. Harlan knew the way. Silas, in his cold, patient fury, would send men and they would burn it. They would salt the earth. It was a place of ghosts, a shelter that had served its purpose. It was compromised. They walked past it, Callum leading, Evelyn holding the back of his worn coat. He led her 2 miles further up the slope, into a high meadow he had always kept secret. It was a bowl of green, hidden by a thick stand of lodgepole pine and aspen, with a clear, fast-running creek that cut through its center. The snow was still deep here, but the air was different. It felt safe. It felt undiscovered. "Here," he said, his voice quiet. "We will build here." They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, his knife, and a small axe he had hidden under a rock nearby. It was not enough. They returned, once, to the cabin. They moved like thieves, in the dead of night, their feet silent on the snow. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but one they had to take. The cabin was as they had left it, the door barred. Harlan had not returned, not yet. They were ghosts in their own recent past. They worked in the cold moonlight, taking only what was essential: the blankets, the iron pot, the tin plates, his rifle and the box of ammunition, the last of the salt, a small bag of dried beans he had in the cellar, and Evelyn, moving with a purpose that surprised him, went to the ruins of the carriage. She spent an hour in the half-buried wreck, emerging with a small, water-damaged leather-bound ledger,
a pencil, and a tin box of her mother's seeds. They carried their meager possessions to the high meadow, and they began. Spring came not as a gentle relief, but as a violent, muddy, chaotic thaw. The world was a mess of running water and saturated earth, and in this mess they built their life. Callum was a man possessed. He worked from the first gray light of dawn until the last purple of dusk. He felled trees, the steady thwack of his axe, the new rhythm of their world. He was building not a shack, but a home. He notched the logs with a precision that was almost reverent. He was building a fortress. Evelyn worked beside him. She had never worked like this. Her hands, soft and pale, were blistered by the second day. By the fourth, they were raw. By the 10th, they were calloused, strong. She peeled the bark from the logs with his drawn knife, her arms aching with a satisfying, clean exhaustion. She chinked the logs with mud and moss, her fingers stained by the earth. She was not the girl from the town. She was not the victim from the storm. She was a woman building her own walls. They didn't speak of the town. They did not speak of Silas. The name was a poison they refused to let into their new world. They spoke of the work. They spoke of the angle of the roof. They spoke of the deer tracks by the creek. It took them a month of relentless, shared labor. When it was done, it was perfect. It was one room, like the old cabin, but it was larger, the logs newer, the roof pitched high and strong. It had a real stone fireplace, built by both of them, stone by heavy stone, and the small window, a single pane of glass Callum had salvaged from the carriage wreck, faced east to greet the morning sun. The day they moved in, they owned nothing but what was inside, but they were, for the first time, rich. Summer settled on the high meadow, a peace, quiet and profound, settled with it. A new rhythm began. Callum hunted. He would leave at dawn, his rifle in hand, and return by midday, a rabbit or a grouse, sometimes a young buck. He was providing, but it was different now. He was not just surviving, he was nurturing. He would spend his afternoons carving. He carved a set of bowls from a piece of fine-grained aspen. He carved a new, stronger latch for the door. He carved a small, perfect figure of a soaring hawk and set it on the mantel. Evelyn planted a garden in the rich, dark soil by the creek. She planted the seeds from her mother's tin, beans and squash and corn. She planted wild herbs she found in the woods. She fought the rabbits and the deer for every sprout. She weeded and watered and prayed over the small, green shoots. She was planting roots. She was planting a future, a thing she had never believed she was allowed to have. Their evenings were quiet. They would eat their simple meal, stew seasoned with wild onion, bread baked in the iron pot, and they would sit by the fire. This fire was not the desperate, raging thing of the blizzard. It was a low, steady, companionable warmth. Evelyn would write, in the leather-bound ledger, with a small, sharpened pencil. She would write. She sat on the floor, the book in her lap, her face serious in the firelight. She wrote not for a diary, but for a reckoning. She wrote about her father, not with anger, but with the cold, sad understanding of his weakness. She wrote about Silas, his parchment skin, his flat, possessive eyes. She wrote about the church, the sea of faces, the moment she had chosen to speak. She wrote about the terror of the storm, the cold, the deep, dark numbness. And she wrote about Callum. She wrote about the first time she saw him, a shadow in the door. She wrote about the willow bark tea and the wooden comb. She wrote about his confession, the shadow of the Cheyenne girl he could not save. She wrote about his anger and his gentleness. She wrote about the night on the bearskin rug, the desperate, honest claiming. She wrote about the night he had carried her, frozen, from the snow. She was taking the jumbled, broken pieces of her past and forging them into a story, her story. Callum would sit in his chair, Watching her, he would be carving, the knife moving slowly in his hands, the scent of pine shavings filling the air. He did not ask to read what she wrote. He knew it was her own private work. It was her soul, and he respected its boundaries. But one night, late, the fire had burned down to embers. Evelyn had fallen asleep where she sat, her head resting against the side of the cot, the ledger open on her lap. Callum stopped his work. He watched her for a long time. Her face was softer in sleep. The lines of fear and hunger eased. She was still too thin, but she was beautiful. She was his. His gaze fell on the book. The page was half full, her handwriting clear and strong. He felt a pang of guilt, but the need to understand, to see the parts of her she could not speak, was stronger. He knelt beside her. He did not touch the book. He just read. He is a quiet man. I do not think the world has ever been kind to him. He hides his heart behind a wall of silence, just as he built these walls of log. But I have seen it. I saw it when he carved the comb. I saw it when he wept, thinking I was dead. He thinks he is a coward, that he is a broken thing. He does not see that his brokenness is what makes him whole. He is the only truly good man I have ever known. I came to this mountain to die. He has taught me how to live. I do not know what the world below us will do. I do not know if Silas will come, but I know this. I am his. I am not property. I am his partner. I am his wife. In all the ways that matter before God, I am home. He stopped reading, his throat tight. He looked at her, at this brave, strong woman who had seen the darkness in him and had not run. He, who had called himself a coward. He, who had let a child die. He had, in saving Evelyn, finally saved himself. He did not wake her. He did not touch the book. He leaned down, his movements slow, his beard brushing her skin. He kissed her shoulder, a soft, reverent press of his lips. A vow, a promise of protection. She stirred, a small, sleepy sound, and he pulled the blanket from the cot and wrapped it around her before banking the fire for the night. The summer grew heavy, hot and still. The crops in Evelyn's garden were full, the corn high, the squash heavy on the vines. They had food, they had shelter, they had each other. But the peace was a fragile thing. They both knew the world was still down there. Silas Croft was not a man who forgot. He was not a man who forgave. He was waiting. Perhaps he was waiting for winter, to trap them, to starve them out. Perhaps he was waiting for the law, for a territorial judge to sign a warrant. They were living on borrowed time. One night, the air broke. A storm, a true summer thunderstorm, rolled in from the west. It was not the silent, white death of the blizzard. This was a war in the sky. The wind hit the cabin, a high, shrieking sound. The trees bent, then the thunder came. A great, cracking explosion that seemed to shake the mountains to their foundations. Lightning split the sky, one brilliant, blinding flash after another, illuminating the small cabin in stark, blue-white light. Evelyn was standing at the window, watching. The rain was not snow. It was a solid, driving sheet of water, hammering against the roof. The storm was all around them, a magnificent, terrifying violence. Callum came to stand beside her. He put his hand on her shoulder. In the old cabin, she would have been trembling. She would have been curled by the fire, her hands over her ears. She turned to him, her face illuminated by another flash of lightning. Her eyes were not wide with terror. They were bright, alive. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "It is another storm," she said, her voice clear over the roar of the wind. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, the calm. "But this time," she said, "I am not afraid." He held her gaze, and the love he felt for her was a thing so large it filled his chest, so strong it hurt. He saw the woman she had become. She was forged from ice and fire. He put his hand on her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin.
"Neither am I," he whispered. The thunder cracked again, a deafening sound, but they did not flinch. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the blizzard. It was not the hesitant, fearful kiss of their first days. It was a kiss of deep, sure and abiding love, a kiss of equals. He lifted her into his arms. She was light, but strong. She wrapped her arms around his neck. He carried her to the bed they had built together, the bed that was theirs. He closed the door to their small bedroom, shutting out the sound of the rain, though not the flash of the lightning. In the flickering, electric light, he laid her down. They came together not in desperation, not in a frantic need to feel alive, but in a slow, sure and profound celebration of the life they had chosen. It was not a rebellion. It was an affirmation. It was the quiet, sacred act of two souls who had found their only harbor, their true home, in each other. It was a love that was not taken or given, but built, log by log, day by day. The storm passed. The morning came, clear and clean. The air washed of its heat and fear. The sun rose over the eastern ridge, filling the small cabin with a warm, rose-colored light. It fell across the bed, across the tangle of limbs and blankets. It illuminated two hands, clasped together on the pillow. His hand, large, calloused, and scarred, was woven with hers, small, strong, and sure. They held each other tightly, even in sleep, as if they would never, ever let go. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the heart of the Wild West. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories, and share your thoughts on Evelyn and Callum's journey.